Hi, I want to talk to you today about Socratic Method. These days, many people advertise that they use the Socratic Method in teaching, but it tends to mean, roughly speaking, that they cold call various students and ask them things like in the famous TV series or movie The Paper Chase, where Professor Kingsfield suddenly calls on a student and says, "Miss Jones, facts of West Coast Hotel versus Parish, please." And suddenly, the student has to respond. Well, Socrates himself didn't quite do it that way. Instead, he tended to address prominent citizens of Athens, as well as students, and ask them questions. They would be asking about usually a practical question. Almost all of the early dialogues depicting Socrates start with a practical question, something like, how should we educate our children, so that they grow up not only being successful and knowledgeable, but also wise, and, moreover, virtuous. We want them to be good people. And so he will say, well, before we inquire into how to educate somebody, we have to understand what that goal is. So, what is virtue? What is courage? What is it to be successful? What is friendship? What is love? What is justice? Later, Socrates starts asking more abstract questions, such as, what is knowledge? What is truth? And so forth. Now, the point here is always that he's looking for a definition. He starts out dealing with a practical problem. And I think that's meant to stress that philosophy is a practical discipline. It's meant to address questions like how to educate your children, how to pursue your own life, how to do various things, and what you ought to be doing. But then he says, look, to understand that, we have to know what our goal is. So we have to know what virtue is. We have to know what justice is. We have to know what knowledge is, and so on. And the crucial question is, in order to know, we have to be able to define these things. In his dialogue, The Laches, which is about courage, he says, and surely what we know we must be able to tell. That, I think, is a crucial assumption for Socrates. What we know, we must be able to tell. Now, it's not so clear that Plato himself endorses this view. Maybe there are all sorts of things that we can know without being able to define them, without being able to tell what we know. And here I don't just mean knowing how to do something. You might know how to ride a bicycle, for example, without being able to explain to anyone how to do it. But I mean knowing that. Knowing, well, gosh, what exactly is involved in knowing what justice is? If we're thinking about how to educate our children to be virtuous, for example, well, we have to understand the goal. What is it we're trying to attain? What is it for someone to be good? What is virtuous? And his idea is, look, we don't really know that unless we can tell someone what virtue is. So typically, these early dialogues of Plato are all about trying to define a crucial term like virtue, courage, self-control, friendship, love, and so forth. Often they do end in frustration, so that the quest is unsuccessful. But here's the way this typically goes. Socrates asks for a definition. He says, what we know we surely must be able to tell. So tell me, what is virtue? What is justice? What is friendship or love or self-control or courage and so forth? And so people propose definitions. Now, one way of looking at this is to say that there is a certain class of things that we are trying to characterize. A class of actions, let's say, that truly are courageous, or that truly are just, etc. So, let's start with that. Imagine a circle containing all and only the things that really do fit our term. That is to say, that really do count as courage, or that really are virtuous, or really are just. Now, we propose a definition. And of course, ideally, those things that satisfy the definition are exactly the things that we're trying to define. So ideally, we really end up with one circle. That is to say, everything that fits our definition really is a case of what we're trying to define, and every such case is covered by our definition. But of course, they might not go like that. It might be that the circles end up overlapping. We've got some good cases that our definition fits that really are what we're trying to define, but we might end up with things that are outliers on both sides. So, for example, we might end up with some things that fit our definition, but nevertheless do not count as, for example, courage or justice or virtue, whatever it is we're trying to define. You might say that that shows that our definition is really too broad. It includes things that really shouldn't be included. We can call those false positives. They are things that our definition says are positive cases, but they're false positives. They aren't really cases. Conversely, it might be that there are real cases of courage or virtue or justice or whatever it is we're trying to define that our definition doesn't capture. That says that in some ways, at least, our definition is too narrow. And so the things that are out there that really are cases that our definition is not covering count as false negatives. That is to say, our definition lists them as negative cases. No, that's not courage. That's not virtue. That's not justice. But actually they are cases, so those are false negative reports. Well, ideally, we want to get rid of the false positives. We want to get rid of the false negatives. Now, as soon as we deal with a hard question, like virtue, or justice, or courage, or self-control, or generosity, or any of the other basic virtues, or, for that matter, things like friendship, love, other kinds of relationships, or even more abstract things like knowledge or truth, it's very hard to say whether we're getting things right, and it's easy to get lost in the philosophical complications. So let's think about some things that may or may not be a little easier. For example, think about what it would be like to try to define a concept familiar to all of us, namely time.
Apply the Socratic method to get to the bottom of different concepts. You might discover that there are some things that you think you know, but you cannot actually define or even put into words. For example, consider the concept of time. Time is the most used noun in the English language, which makes sense because time is an inescapable phenomenon. And we all think we know what time is. But if I ask you for a definition of time, if I apply the Socratic method and ask you, what is time, you'll find it extremely difficult to come up with a good response. In fact, the more you try to come up with a good response, the more impossible it seems. And I think this sentiment was best expressed by St. Augustine. In his book, Confessions, he says, "What is time? If no one asks me, I know. But if I wish to explain it to one who asks, I know not."
Well, time turns out to be pretty hard. So let's think about something easier. For example, odds are you're sitting down right now. You're sitting in a chair, let's say. Well, do you know that you're sitting in a chair? Are you sure of that? Do you know what a chair is? You're likely to think that's crazy. Of course I know what a chair is. Yes, I'm sitting down in a chair. I know what a chair is. But it's not quite that simple. Actually, let's say we follow Socrates. Surely what you know, you must be able to tell. So tell me, what is a chair? Now, for years in my introductory philosophy class in the first week, I've been doing this. I've been asking people, you probably think right now you're sitting down in a chair. Well, surely you must know what a chair is. Everybody says, yeah, I know what a chair is. Good. Then tell me, what is a chair? Here's the first response, typically. A piece of furniture. Well, that's true. A chair is a piece of furniture. But on the other hand, that's not a very good definition. Why not? Well, part of the reason is that it's rather unclear. And indeed, often Socrates raises that kind of challenge to a definition. He says, well, that's kind of unclear. And especially if it says, well, it's a kind of this or a sort of that. He says, well, yeah, what kind? What sort? We have to pin it down a little more than that. So surely the first thing he would say is, what kind of furniture? What sort of piece of furniture? After all, if we just say a piece of furniture, that's much too broad. That includes chairs, tables, sofas, beds, nightstands, all sorts of things that are not chairs. So we better rule that out, and we better think about doing something a bit more specific than just pieces of furniture. That includes far too much. Well, when I challenge people to come up with something more, they usually come up with something like the dictionary definition. What is a chair? Well, it's a piece of furniture that has 4 legs and a back. Now, is it a good definition? Are there false positives? Are there false negatives? That is to say, are there things our definition counts as chairs, things that do have 4 legs and a back, but are not chairs? On the other hand, are there chairs that don't have four legs and a back and so aren't covered by our definition? Those things will be false negatives. Well, let's analyze that definition. A chair is a piece of furniture with four legs and a back. Can you think of examples of things with four legs and a back that are pieces of furniture but aren't chairs? Take a moment and think about that. It shouldn't be too hard to realize, wait a minute, there are benches. There are, for example, sofas, couches. There are divans or other things, kind of old-fashioned furniture, that we wouldn't really count as chairs. There might be day beds, other kinds of things like that, that are furniture, that do have four legs, that do have a back, but we couldn't count as chairs. So it looks like our definition covers much too much. It's still too broad. There are lots of false positives, things that have four legs and a back but aren't chairs. So we have to do more. Now typically people respond by saying, well, I see the problem. Benches and sofas and day beds and things of that kind, that more than one person can sit on those. And so the problem is they're too big. We need to pin it down. We'll say a chair is a piece of furniture that has four legs and a back, and it's for one person to sit on. Okay? So we've got a chair being something, piece of furniture, four legs and a back, designed for one person to sit in. How is that as a definition? Well, it's certainly better. It will rule out love seats and sofas and couches and longer benches and things like that. So it's way better as a definition. It's going to have many fewer false positives. And that makes sense. We've shrunk that circle by adding certain conditions. And so we're going to now have something that's a bit narrower. So yes, there are going to be fewer false positives. But is it now an adequate definition? Well, one problem is that it might still be too broad. That is to say, there still might be false positives. After all, think about a stool. A bar stool, for example. It might have four legs and a back. It's a piece of furniture. It's designed for one person to sit on. But we'd say it's a stool. It's not a chair. And so we still have false positives. Our definition is still too broad. But there's another problem with it. We have shrunk it enough that it is now, in some ways, too narrow. Maybe, in fact, it's going to point out that our definition before was also too narrow. We get false negatives, even with the four legs and a back criterion, let alone the design for one person to sit on. For example, there are hanging chairs. They are designed for one person to sit on. They're chairs, they're suspended from the top, but they don't have four legs. They do have a back. They are, I suppose, pieces of furniture, but now, no four legs, so, according to our definition, not a chair. But it is a chair. That's a false negative. There are other cases. There are examples of chairs that have only one leg, or have only two legs, or have three legs. Some of them have more than four legs. In fact, it's a common style of office chair to have one sort of pipe descending from the seat part of the chair that goes into an array of five things, often that have wheels on them. Well, I don't know whether to call that one leg or five legs, or to say that doesn't really have legs at all, it has some other mechanism. But whatever we say about that kind of office chair, it doesn't fit our definition either. Plainly a chair, but on the other hand doesn't have four legs, and so it's ruled out by our definition. Another false negative. We have chairs that seem not to have four legs in other ways, that have, for example, something that almost looks like sleigh tracks or rungs of some kind under them. We have chairs that simply sit on discs of some sort. We have chairs that are sculpted in such a way that it's hard to describe any sort of leg at all, that really just have a shape that sits on the floor. We have a kind of chair, actually popular among some members of my department, that has, well, it doesn't have four legs, it doesn't have a back, it's supposed to improve your posture, and they find it comfortable. But notice, it doesn't have four legs. Also notice, it doesn't have a back, and yet it's described as a chair. What about a rocking chair? A rocking chair might have four legs that go into a rocker type mechanism, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe it has more. Maybe it has fewer, depending on the design of the rocking chair. Maybe it just has sides that go down to the rocker part. And so, rocking chairs not always maybe, but quite often, are going to violate our criterion too. They're going to turn out to be false negatives. Finally, we get the defeater for almost any attempted definition of a chair. A beanbag chair. Beanbag chairs are chairs. We call them chairs. On the other hand, they don't have 4 legs or any number of legs. They don't have a back. They sort of form a back when you sit on them. Sometimes, not always. Depends on how big the beanbag chair is and how big you are. And so that's something that doesn't appear to fit our definition. Yeah, we call it a chair. Now that's going to be tough, because the moment we start saying, well, look, maybe we've been far too restrictive. And indeed, this is a move people often make. They say we've been too restrictive. We were talking about 4 legs and a back, and as we've seen, the 4-leg part, that's typical, it's commonplace, but it's not strictly necessary. You can be a chair and not have 4 legs. The back part, well, that's much more common, but still, as that kind of posture chair or a beanbag chair indicate, a chair doesn't always have a back. So maybe we end up saying, all right, forget all of that. We were too concerned about shape. It's really just a piece of furniture designed for one person to sit on. But now, it looks like we're much too broad again. Now we include footstools. Now we include other kinds of things. These Italian-designed pieces of furniture, for example, that are designed to be seats, but are really just discs that sit on the floor. Stools, then, are not chairs, but they're designed for one person to sit on. And so it looks like now we're too broad once again. Are we in some other ways too narrow? Maybe. Could you have a chair designed for more than one person to sit on, or designed for no one to sit on? Well, in a sense, yes, as long as we mean person in the usual way. After all, what about dollhouse furniture? A little chair in a dollhouse is designed for a doll to sit in, but on the other hand, it's not designed for a person to sit in. It's much too small. There are also sculpted chairs that are very large. Actually, they're designed for many people to sit in, even though they still have the shape of chairs, and we would refer to them as chairs. They have the shape of a chair, but on the other hand, they aren't designed for one person to sit on. So it looks like we've got a tension. We've got this definition based on shape. It's a piece of furniture with 4 legs and a back. We've got another competing definition. It's a piece of furniture designed for one person to sit in. If we put them together, we end up with something that's far too narrow. If we take them apart and consider each one individually, it looks as if we've got something that is both too broad and too narrow. And so we are not really quite sure what to do. It looks like sometimes we have in mind primarily the shape, other times we have primarily in mind the function, but we don't strictly go by either one. And it's going to turn out that many definitions are like this. They have different kinds of components, and they're all relevant. We can't leave them out, but on the other hand, we can't strictly speaking combine them either, because then we end up with something too narrow. Well, what should we conclude from this? Well, one thing you might conclude is we don't know how to define chair. Have I shaken your confidence that you're sitting down in a chair, that you know what a chair is? Well, you might say, no, you haven't. Actually, I'm still pretty sure I know what a chair is. I know how to use this term. I know that I'm sitting in one. Maybe I can't put it into words. Maybe I can't give you a definition. But still, I know what it is. So Socrates must be wrong to say what I know I must be able to tell. Often there are things I know that I can't tell. That's one response. Maybe it's even Plato's response. In these early dialogues, there are some scholars who argue that it is. Here's another way of looking at the problem. We might say, well, actually you have shaken my confidence. I'm no longer very sure what a chair is. There are some paradigm cases, things that have 4 legs and a back and are designed for one person to sit in, that are good cases under the definition, and those I'm sure of. Those are definitely chairs. But now when you give me an example like a beanbag chair or a large sculpted chair, I don't know what to say. Maybe I'm wrong to call those chairs. Or maybe I put them in some kind of chair-like borderline. And I say, I don't know, maybe they're chairs, maybe they're not. I'm not really sure. You haven't shaken my confidence on the central cases. I'm sure those are chairs. And if you show me a couch or a table, I say, yeah, I'm sure those are not chairs. And so, look, there are lots of things that I think are plainly false cases, plainly true cases. But now, yeah, there are a lot more things that are rather unclear than I would have expected. Now, that seems strange, but on the other hand, I have had quite a few students over the years say, okay, we call beanbag chairs chairs, but they aren't really chairs. We call that kind of thing you sit on to improve your posture a chair, but it doesn't have four legs, it doesn't have a back, it is not a chair. It's a misuse of the term. And maybe they're right. How do we know whether that's a misuse of the term, or whether it really is the case that we don't yet understand what a chair is? It's a complicated question, and I think we can take different attitudes about it. The same thing is going to arise when we face questions later on about the nature of virtue itself, or the nature of knowledge, the nature of justice, or of truth. We're going to say, well, here are some things that seem characteristic of the central cases of knowledge, or truth, or virtue, or justice. Are they true of all cases? Are there cases that our definition doesn't cover? And often we're going to find that there are. What do we do about that? How do we respond? Maybe we say, so we don't know what virtue and justice and truth and knowledge are. Maybe we say, well, I know this in central cases, I know other things are not, and then there are these other cases that seem vague and I'm not exactly sure anymore what to say. I used to know what to say, but now I don't. Here's an especially puzzling case. Think about a high chair. That is to say, something, typically 4 legs and a back, designed for one person, a baby, to sit in. It's a chair, right? It looks like it meets all our criteria. And yet think about something that has the same shape, fairly tall, 4 legs, a back, designed for one person to sit on, but we refer to that as a stool rather than a chair. How is that? It turns out that if something that shape is made for a baby, we call it a chair. If it's made for an adult human, we call it a stool. And yet it looks like that's something that should be in the very core of our definition. It meets the criteria of shape. It's a piece of furniture with 4 legs and a back. Moreover, it has the same function. It is designed for one person to sit on. And so, why is a high chair a chair, but a stool not a chair? You might at that point say, maybe our concept just doesn't make any sense. Maybe it really can't be defined. Maybe it's so zigzaggy to draw it as a circle or a square or something like that is really misleading. It's some bizarre kind of thing and nothing's really going to quite match it. So that's another possibility. It might be that our concepts, the basic concepts we use all the time, that are really pre-theoretical concepts, are like that. They're so gerrymandered, so confusing, that maybe it's impossible to give any clear definition of what they are. That doesn't mean it won't be possible to give definitions of other terms. We might be able to define a triangle or a circle in geometry just fine, but maybe certain basic things like chair or table or mountain or a variety or time, maybe those things are going to turn out to be just indefinable. And so we're going to look at a variety of different ways of approaching these questions. But it's important to understand the nature of the method, what it's generally trying to do, but also understand that it may have potential limitations and to be sensitive to those as we approach more serious philosophical questions.